When I used to think of boundaries, I would often imagine sort of this fixed line, sort of that I would draw in the sand, thinking in the way of if you cross this line, this is going to be my response, or these are going to be the consequences. And while that does make sense in a lot of relational dynamics in which there is just no movement or no potential for change on the part of another person, then that more fixed boundary may make sense. And looking at it that way may actually be a really important pathway of protecting yourself, both physically and psychologically. But over time, I've taken on a more embodied understanding of boundaries as not necessarily a fluid understanding of boundaries or a more permeable understanding of boundaries. I think that's where a lot of harm can take place when boundaries are incredibly permeable. But this embodied notion of boundaries comes into play with the work of Maurice Merleau Ponty. He was a French philosopher in the mid 20th century and really put on the map this idea of embodied perception. That while I may have in my own understanding of self a impression that I want to give off to others, that will always be filtered through others' perceptions of me. And oftentimes those do not align in ways that create social conflict. So when another's perception of me does not align with the impression that I am seeking to present to others, there is this inherent clash or incompatibility between both of our perceptions. And as Ponty discusses, this sense of perception comes within our bodies. It's not necessarily a cognitive response to others in our lives. It's a deeply felt response in our bodies of how we interact with others, how we see ourselves in relation to others. And so when I look at boundaries, I've come to a term that is drawn out of Merleau-Ponty's work called lived distance. And I really like this phrasing when talking and thinking about boundaries because it gives me permission to create space with individuals in which that crossing of perceptions is not aligned. And in some ways, it may never be aligned based on who I am standing in my body and my personhood versus their personhood. And if those perceptions don't align, this idea of lived distance enables me to still see them as a human, see them as someone who has faults just like I do, but also creating this spaciousness between us that enables me to keep not only at a safe distance, but be able to evolve in my own understanding of self apart from that person. I think it's a really helpful way of transitioning for women in particular out of this space of needing to fulfill the needs of others and in many ways needing to contort ourselves to fill in the needs that others have rather than making those adjustments and those contortions of self by maintaining your own integrity and looking at boundaries as this lived distance. We're able to really restore a sense of wholeness and self within our own bodies without compromising that in order to fulfill the needs or perceptions that others may have of us. So I offer this as encouragement for women who are in a transition of self that's moving away from the people-pleasing, over-functioning, perhaps overachieving individual, always trying to fill in what others' perceptions of us are that are oftentimes inconsistent with who we see ourselves as. So looking at a boundary as a lived distance, we are able to then more fully move into and live into who we are at our core as a person, while also accepting the fact that others' perceptions of us may not be as fluid and that it's not our responsibility to change ourselves to fit into that. It's really their responsibility to adjust those on their own, and if they cannot, for us to make choices about how we want to interact and communicate and relate to those individuals.